Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for April 1st, 2022. And on this episode, I've got a quick story from the USPS that gives us a lesson on the necessary and proper clause, how they use it today versus how it was intended under the Constitution. For that, I've got James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, the legal doctrine of principles and incidents, and more. Make sure you're following us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. There you're going to find links to all the stuff I mentioned in this episode and for every episode included in the show notes on the individual blog for each episode. You're also going to find all the different platforms are on. We've got video platforms, audio-only podcast platforms, and even our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. The show homepage again is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And what got me thinking about this episode is I came across this blog post by Nicholas Anthony over at the Cato at Liberty blog titled "Only 6 People Use the Postal Banking System." A postal banking pilot program. There were goals of maybe to help the unbanked, maybe to generate revenue for USPS, which of course we know is struggling quite a bit. And here Nicholas reports, in November of last year, employees at the postal banking pilot location in the Bronx, New York, said they had not seen any customers in the Bronx. This is going to be busy. Had not seen any customers since the September 13th start of the program. So this is obviously, well, we'll get to that in a moment. The reality turned out to be much worse than that, though. The USPS reported that across all locations, just 6 checks had been cashed for a total value of $548. Only 6 checks cashed and a bunch of different, it wasn't a huge pilot program, but the fact that no one is using it, really, let's look at this. And of course, we're talking about the postal clause, first of all, which is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 7, which empowers Congress to establish post offices and post roads. Now, if you're like me, you might be asking a question like, okay, yeah, let's just say they can do this post office thing. We can read it like that, but can they just get involved in whatever business venture might be kind of related or that they can fit into their business model just so they can either help people or raise revenue or whatever? Here's how James Madison told us that we're supposed to read the Constitution in his report of 1800. He says, whenever a question arises concerning the constitutionality of a particular power, the first question we ask, whether the power be expressed in the Constitution. If it be, the question is decided, and I think we can go along with the idea that Congress has the power to establish post offices. But there's nothing at all mentioned, not a single word about establishing banking services. So we have to go to Madison's second question. He says, if it be not expressed, the next inquiry must be whether it is properly an incident to an express power and necessary to its execution. If it be, it may be exercised by Congress. If it be not, Congress cannot exercise it. And regarding the post office and banking services, what we're talking about is the necessary and proper clause here and the legal doctrine of principles and incidents. Let's first start out with the text of the necessary and proper clause at the end of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Congress has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Legal doctrine of principles and incidents. This is explaining necessary and proper. In order to be an incidental, mind you, this is not an implied power or an ancillary regulation, incidental. You have to fit 2 things. 1, it must be subordinate, lesser than the expressly delegated power. And 2, a customary or necessary way of carrying out the express power. Now, if only 6 people have tried this, maybe it isn't all that customary, but we can talk about that a little bit more in a minute. James Madison described the clause like this again from his report of 1800. He said, the plain import of this clause is that Congress shall have all the incidental or instrumental powers necessary and proper for carrying into execution all the express powers, whether they be vested in the government of the United States more collectively or in the several departments or officers thereof. He says it is not a grant of new powers to Congress. It's not a grant of new powers to Congress. So they delegated a power to establish a post office. Does that mean they can establish, I don't know, an office supply store? I'm getting into some silly, we'll get into other examples in just a minute. He said it is not a grant of new powers to Congress, but merely a declaration for the removal of all uncertainty that the means of carrying into execution those otherwise granted are included in the grant of power, the delegation of power, that is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, necessary and proper. I did an episode on this that covered it in much more detail back in the summer of 2019, almost 3 years ago now. Hopefully it still stands the test of time. We're talking about founding principles, so it should be pretty timeless. Necessary and proper, not anything and everything. Of course, I will link to that in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Here's how Mike Maharrey describes it. In simplest terms, a necessary and proper clause, and you can have this in any kind of legal document, doesn't just have to be a constitution. A necessary and proper clause authorizes an agent to exercise powers not explicitly spelled out in the legal document, but necessary to execute the specific authority given to him. It serves as a kind of shorthand and eliminates the need to list out every incidental power the agent can exercise, and it makes it actually, without it, it makes it very difficult for an agent actually to do any work. Like if you delegate power to a manager to run a grocery store, let's get into that example. Mike writes, imagine if I contract with someone to manage my grocery store. I didn't know he had one, but it's a good analogy. If I stipulate that she has all the powers necessary and proper to running a grocery store, I don't have to specify that she has the authority to pay a guy to clean the floors, or to hire a mechanic to fix a freezer when it goes down, or to pay a soda vendor. Those powers are proper and customary and actually necessary to running a grocery store. Hey, you're in charge of making sure this thing runs and it works. But necessary and proper wouldn't give this new manager the authority to give away all the food in the store and turn the grocery store into something else. It doesn't even authorize them to actually start a brand new business. They may have to check in to see if they're authorized. Does it authorize them to just, well, let's think of the post office. Does necessary and proper authorize the post office just because they can help people find stuff or help people purchase things or help their bottom line start also selling things like alcohol or tobacco? You can make a lot of money on those things, right? Or firearms. And I guess if they did all three of those, they'd actually be what the ATF should have been doing all along, acting as a store. Now, that's basically the argument that they're making today when they say, and then back all the way to the postal savings powers that they had early in the 20th century. And again, under these pilot programs to include banking services under the postal clause, they're basically saying we can do whatever we want, not whatever is necessary and proper. Now back to Cato at Liberty blog. He says, yet many postal banking advocates argue that the post office is the perfect conduit for channeling banking services into areas without brick and mortar banks. The fact that only 6 people use the pilot is evidence that this argument is clearly flawed, but it's important to note that this result should not be a surprise. He's got some interesting history and some statistics. I will link to that blog post in the show notes so you can read and learn more on your own time. Thomas Jefferson, I think, summed it up the best, and here is his 1791 arguments on the constitutionality of a national bank. You wouldn't be surprised that he said, no, it's not authorized. One of the arguments they made at that point, again, was necessary and proper. And he says the Constitution allows only the means which are necessary, and this is highlighted, necessary, not those which are merely convenient for effecting the enumerated powers. And with the Postal Service, those that are necessary, not those that are just merely helpful for them to reach their bottom lines. Because as I gave as an example, with that in mind, they could just turn into what the ATF should have been all along. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope there was at least a little bit of entertainment here. I hope it was educational, more important than anything. I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. If you support what we do, you support us reaching and teaching more people about the Constitution and liberty, and more importantly, even than that, how to defend both when the government refuses to do so, which is constantly. You can put your financial faith behind our work over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members for as little as $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. You can also help us spread the word by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, smashing the like button, leaving comments, subscribing, getting notifications on the video platforms. All this stuff tells those, especially the mainstream ones, mainstream platforms, it tells the algorithm to show us to more people, and it really does help a great deal. Again, I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.